the Grand Theft Auto of gacha games. Like it or not, that's what I think a lot of people are expecting Neverness to Everness to be. Well, at least some sort of anime variant of Grand Theft Auto. Whether that's a good comparison or not, I feel like that's the sentiment we'll be seeing when NTE releases. So in this video, I want to have a realistic discussion about NTE and take a look at all the pros and cons that we know so far, while also comparing it to the broader gacha landscape as it is today. This video is not about trying to doom the game or be overly negative about it. I want to have fun and be excited about upcoming games, but I also realize it's important to take a measured approach on new releases nowadays. And I will also be covering this game extensively before and after its launch. So first of all, we gotta talk about the name of the game itself. Neverness to Everness just doesn't roll off the tongue very well, and I feel like most people will just end up abbreviating the game down to NTE most of the time. But it's not really that big of a deal, and I think people will eventually just get used to the name as time goes on. Sure, the name might not be a huge deal, I guess, but Hada Studio might be a red flag for some people. Of course, Hada is known to have made Tower Fantasy. And let's be real, the launch of Tower Fantasy was really off-putting to a lot of gamers who decided to give it a try. But I believe Hada Studio has learned a lot since the launch of Tower Fantasy, and I think we see a lot of what they learned being put into NTE. So let's go through a list of points where we can see improvements in Neverness to Everness design and development that really sets it apart from Tower Fantasy.
Hi, I'm glad you could join me there. You sort of caught me fiddling around here a little bit.
Animations and cutscenes look much better than Tower of Fantasy's initial release. Characters look like they have quirky and fun personalities from the cutscenes we've seen so far, so that's a good sign. As a matter of fact, the game overall looks well-rounded and just more polished. The optimization seems to be promising as well, considering the game will be launching with a 120 FPS mode on PC. Now, as far as mobile optimization, we won't know for sure, but NTE will be using Unreal Engine 5. Now that could bring some issues to mobile, but I've also heard that Unreal Engine 5 is much more optimized for mobile devices. Of course, it will all depend on how hard they want to push the envelope with particle effects, textures, draw distance, and just how graphically demanding they want the game to be. So mobile optimization is up in the air for now. For those who prefer a dark and gloomy atmosphere, maybe this game won't be for you. But at the same time, the colorful billboards and city lights all blend really well and give a Tokyo City Akihabara vibe to it. And personally, I love this style of city design. The interdimensional spatial zones have an abstract art style that differentiates itself from the rest of the game as well, which I think looks really nice. Speaking of world design, I think even later patches of Tower of Fantasy really show that some of the devs over at Hada Studio have learned how to make city landscapes with a sense of scale that's immersive and gives a feeling of grandeur, such as the recent futuristic metropolis in Tower of Fantasy, and you can see this translate over to NTE as well within its cityscape. So it looks like Hada Studio has really upped its game when it comes to animations, world building, and hopefully optimization. While the animations and designs may not be the best in the business, I still think they're showing a competency level that's worth taking into consideration.
You're going to love this. Trust me, what you're seeing now is my normal state.
It's time to move on to a more pressing concern for a lot of people interested in Neverness to Everness, and that would be, of course, the combat. A full-on disclaimer here, I have not played the game myself, so I'll only be extrapolating information we got from certain content creators that have had a chance to play Neverness to Everness. Braxophone says the combat is akin to a mixture of the simplicity of Genshin's character kits with a simpler reaction system crossed in with a bit of Wuthering Waves style combat. Although I'm not seeing the Wuthering Waves connection to combat here, I first want to address the gacha elephant in the room, so to speak. And that is, Wuthering Waves and Zenless Zone Zero players are most likely not going to be happy with the combat we see on display here. I'm expecting this to be a point of contention for the game, as nowadays a lot of action aficionados really want combat systems to have a certain amount of complexity, depth, and challenge to them. In Neverness to Everness, it looks like there will be some sort of elemental system that triggers a reaction called an Esper cycle. These Esper cycles can seem to only combine with other elements that are next to each other on the elemental wheel. As seen in the example, Cosmos and Anima trigger an Esper cycle that creates a sort of hyperbloom reaction called Blossom. Other reactions like Hex give the target a damage over time, while a reaction called Echo increases Psyche and Lakshana damage, so it's just a straight up damage buff. This elemental system doesn't seem to be as complex as Genshin's, but we won't know for sure how in-depth it will be until we can test it out and try it for ourselves. Braxophone did also mention the feel of NTE's combat being more similar to Grand Blue Fantasy Relink, which is a very interesting comparison to make. Because if there's one thing that Grand Blue Fantasy Relink did really well, is the combat being very visceral. It has very good hit connection, and the feedback with each hit feels really nice, while still having a fast enough pace to it as to not feel too slow and sluggish. So Brax's comparison to Grand Blue Relink here gives me high hopes that NTE's combat will have a good feel to it and will flow fairly well with lots of fluidity. That, on top of the Esper Cycle system, will also allow for decent variations in team building and rotations. I'm going to assume NTE's combat will be more along the casual side of things, where it'll still be fun enough to want to think of optimizing character builds, contemplating new teams, and who knows, there might be some fun challenges in the game, but I'm not expecting the combat to be intense on the same level as the new Zenless Zone Zero Tower Climb or Wuthering Waves hologram boss fights. All that being said about combat, I think it's perfectly fine to have a battle system that isn't so intense, and it doesn't have to be the main focus of each and every game that has action combat. A more simplistic system makes it easier for most people to pick up and play, especially on mobile devices. I know some of you out there say that you can do ball-busting combat on your phones, but most people really can't. Now take all these assumptions about Neverness to Everness's combat with a grain of salt, because we can only know for sure once more of the game is revealed to us. I would like to be pleasantly surprised to know that the game would be adding some challenge modes for players to sink their teeth into, as I know a lot of people, including myself, do enjoy it when games have a deep and engaging battle system to mess around with, that also includes some really tough bosses where you find yourself actually using the retry button. But there is of course more to mess around with in Neverness to Everness, as we've all seen with the extensive focus on motor vehicular operations. Vehicle handling and control might feel a bit basic, but we did see that there's a bit of drifting here and there, so the physics might not be completely stiff and clunky. However, the lack of consequences for driving around the city will off-put people who expect there to be a Grand Theft Auto-like feeling to the game. Even if you disagree with that sentiment, there will be people out there that feel a lack of immersion in the game world due to smashing up the town with your car not having any repercussions. And I can sympathize with that criticism to a certain extent. I would personally like it if there are some consequences to trashing up the town, but I'll go into it with an open mind for now and see how it all plays out in the grand scope of the game. Before we go on to the next set of topics, I want to say again that I'll be covering Neverness to Everness as much as possible before and after release of the game, with some guides, tips and tricks, and also streaming the game quite a bit when it comes out. So if you're interested in Neverness to Everness content and updates, consider sticking around the channel. We just hit 200 subscribers and I really appreciate the support from all of you who stuck around. There's also a Discord to join if you're interested as well, so thanks again and we'll continue on with the video.
It's called the Midwest because every single thing in it is mid.
If there's one point of critique that I want to see Neverness to Everness stay away from, is the constant need to compare itself to Genshin Impact. As a matter of fact, I think most games need to stop claiming to be the next Genshin killer, and I think Hotta Studio learned their lesson with Tower of Fantasy. That being said, I really hope the NTE community itself does not compare it to other games 24/7. You can coexist in the same gaming landscape without constantly trying to trash talk other games and their communities, effectively alienating a large player base when there's no real reason to do so. On the other side of the argument, you could say that, well, there's only so much time people can put into open world live service games. The more of these type of games that come out, the more they're competing for people's time. And especially with gacha players, a lot of these gacha games are made for people who have a limited amount of time to play each day. So all we can hope for is that Neverness to Everness has enough to set itself apart from the competition and give good reasons for many players to want to give the game a shot over other games in the genre. I believe Neverness to Everness Direct Competition is a game that's not even released yet, which of course is Project Mugen. Project Mugen looks like a more polished product, but how much of the game of what we saw was actually real and not just a carefully woven tech demo, we don't know for sure. The game has fallen silent as of now, so nobody knows for sure how far along Project Mugen is, but NTE has a distinct advantage against Mugen. That is, of course, Neverness to Everness looks like to be an actual game, whereas Project Mugen just seems to be vaporware as of now. But being released first isn't always a guaranteed success. Genshin may have been the first breakthrough open-world gacha game, but other genres have shown that coming first is a double-edged sword. If you fail to impress the first time around, a competitor can swoop in and find success in areas that you weren't aware of. The last major point we should ask about Neverness to Everness is this. What is the main form of content we'll be doing in the game? Exploring? Fighting bosses? Questing? Basically, what is the meat of the game? It's known that we'll be able to roam around the city and have random enemy encounters that teleport us into another dimension. But how often does this happen? Is roaming around the city going to be useful to some extent? Will we be questing around the map, doing random story missions, while also getting transported into the other dimension to fight enemies and bosses? And to briefly touch on the subject of player housing and having our own custom apartments, I'm hoping these residences have another purpose to them, other than just being trophy showcases for our achievements in-game. These are the main questions that NTE should answer next. Neverness to Everness looks like a fairly well-polished game, and everything seems set in place with regards to combat, world building, and characters, except I'm a bit concerned about what the meat of the content is in the game. We need to know more about the gameplay loop Neverness to Everness will be engaging us in. Is it satisfying enough to grip players into wanting to log in and keep up with the game and its subsequent updates? Will there be enough patch content to keep players wanting to stick around for the long term? Hopefully we get answers to these questions soon. I'm sure it'll be fun to roam around a living, breathing city and find out if there's some fun and interesting little secrets to discover. All in all, I'm definitely going to be playing Neverness to Everness, and I'm excited to try out something new. Let me know what your thoughts on Neverness to Everness are, and comment down below about what you want to see from this next major gacha release. Now let's all go back to having a good time together and making fun of the only community that deserves ridicule, and that community is balding men. But I'm immune to such ridicule because I have a full, healthy head of hair. I promise you. Hair reveal stream when?